This happened just after 11, when I let Maisie out. The air was cold enough to make me shiver in my slippers, but I stepped onto the patio anyway, watching her nose the ground by the edge of the field behind our house. It's quiet here, miles away from streetlights and traffic, with nothing but grass stretching out to a line of oak trees that mark the horizon. I almost missed it. It wasn't a plane, or a drone. It wasn't anything familiar. Then it grew brighter, sharper, until I couldn't look directly at it. Maisie noticed it too. She froze mid-step, her head tilting up in that way dogs do when something doesn't belong. The object was circular, glowing like it had its own atmosphere. It just sat there, silently, as though observing. It didn't flicker or waver. When I tried to focus on its edges, the light overwhelmed my eyes. For a few seconds, I didn't move. It was just me, Maisie, and this thing. Then it started dripping. I don't know how else to describe it. Pieces of something molten, something impossibly hot, fell from the object in slow, deliberate drops. They didn't hiss or smoke when they hit the ground, and yet they looked heavy, like liquid metal cooling as soon as it landed. I thought about stepping closer, but my legs refused to move. The object shifted suddenly, sliding to the left, its light dimming just enough to reveal its mass. It wasn't small, it had presence, solid, unnervingly so. It glided out of view behind the oak trees, leaving the field darker than it had been before. Maisie barked. I called her inside and locked the door. Upstairs, my husband was reading. When I told him what happened, he didn't laugh or brush it off. "We'll check the field tomorrow," he said. That night, helicopters passed over our house, loud enough to wake us. Military activity isn't rare here, but something about their pattern seemed intentional. In the morning, we walked to the field. It took time, but we found them. The droplets were small, almost insignificant at first glance, but when you picked one up, the strangeness was obvious. They were layered, fused, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I held a piece up to the sunlight, turning it over in my hands. "Do you feel that?" my husband asked. I nodded, though I couldn't explain it. It wasn't heat. It wasn't weight. It was something else. The helicopters didn't leave. They circled all through the following day, low and deliberate, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Maisie, normally indifferent to the sounds of the world, barked and paced the house, her nails clicking on the wooden floors. I watched from the upstairs window, squinting at the olive-green shapes in the sky. There was no pattern to their movements, no obvious search grid. They just hovered. Their persistence was unnerving. By the second day, the noise was constant. They passed directly over the house, so close I could feel the vibrations in my chest. I hadn't told anyone about what we found in the field, not even my neighbors. My husband and I agreed. It was better to stay quiet, until we knew more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone already knew. That evening, just as the helicopters finally seemed to pull back, the knock came. It wasn't frantic, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. The kind that announces authority. Maisie growled low in her throat, her ears pinned back as she stared at the door. Two men stood on the porch. They wore plain black suits, no logos or insignias, and carried themselves like they didn't want to be questioned. One of them had a clipboard, the other had nothing at all, but his hands stayed in his pockets, as if holding on to something out of sight. "Good evening," the man with the clipboard said when I opened the door. "We're following up on some reports from the area." "Reports?" He nodded, glancing past me into the house before meeting my eyes again. "Unusual aerial activity over the past few nights. Did you or anyone in your household happen to see anything?" My husband came down the stairs behind me, his presence grounding me. The man with the clipboard shifted his weight, and for a second, I thought he might push past us to come inside. "I heard helicopters," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and some lights, but I didn't get a good look." The man tilted his head, studying me in a way that made my skin prickle. "Nothing else?" I shook my head. "Is this something we should be worried about?" The second man spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. "There's nothing to be concerned about. Just routine inquiries." He didn't blink as he said it. For a moment, the quiet between us stretched too long. Maisie barked again, her sharp voice breaking the tension. The man with the clipboard jotted something down and closed it with a snap. "Thank you for your time," he said. "If you do notice anything else, don't hesitate to report it." They left without another word. I stood in the doorway, watching them go, half expecting them to turn around or hesitate. But they didn't. The car started, pulled onto the main road, and disappeared into the distance. The helicopters moved on, and the field behind our house returned to the quiet nothingness it had always been. Maisie relaxed, her usual indifference returning. Even my husband seemed convinced that whatever had happened was over, but I wasn't so sure. Maisie's behavior was the first sign. She became restless, her once playful demeanor replaced by unease. She'd sit by the back door, staring out into the darkness of the field as though waiting for something. At night, she refused to sleep in her usual spot by the couch. Instead, she paced the house, nails clicking against the hardwood in endless loops. I noticed changes in myself too, dreams I couldn't explain. Lucid, vivid, oppressive. At first, I thought they were nightmares, but they didn't feel like dreams at all. I'd wake in my bed, paralyzed. The room would seem darker than usual, filled with a silence so deep it pressed against my ears. I'd try to move, to speak, but my body refused. Then they'd come. Small, shadowy figures, no taller than a child, would appear at the edges of my vision. They didn't have faces, only outlines, and they moved without sound. I couldn't tell if they were watching me, or if they were working, examining perhaps. I felt their presence more than I saw them, an unbearable sense of being studied. The dreams always ended abruptly, snapping me back into wakefulness with my heart racing, and the sheets damp with sweat. The molten drippings stayed tucked away in the garage. My husband insisted we keep them. I wanted to get rid of them, bury them, toss them in the river, anything to be rid of their weight, but he argued we should hold on to them. Then, everything escalated. I woke again in darkness, my chest heavy with that familiar, suffocating stillness. Only this time, it wasn't just a dream, or if it was, it felt more real than any of the others. The room was bathed in faint, pulsing light. I turned my head, straining against the paralysis, and saw the source. The field was alive with glowing orbs. They hovered just above the ground, bright but hazy, as though surrounded by mist. Their light flickered rhythmically, in patterns that seemed deliberate. Maisie was frozen at the foot of the bed, her body rigid, eyes wide but unblinking. She wasn't growling or barking, just still, like a statue. The figures appeared again, not in my room this time, but outside, emerging from the mist or fog that was accumulating beneath the orbs. There were dozens of them now, all moving toward the house in unison. They didn't walk so much as glide, their forms shifting slightly as they approached. Some stopped at the windows, peering inside, their outlines dark against the glowing light. Others surrounded the house, their movements slow and purposeful. I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. My mind screamed at my body to move, but I remained locked in place. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the orbs dimmed, their glow overtaken by the roar of approaching helicopters. The thudding of rotor blades shook the house. Beams of blinding white light cut through the darkness. Unmarked black vehicles sped down the lane, tires kicking up gravel as they skidded to a stop. Chaos erupted. The figures outside dissolved into the mist, disappearing as though they'd never been there. The orbs vanished, their glow replaced by the harsh glare of searchlights. I could hear shouting, the metallic clang of doors slamming. The front door burst open, splintering under the force of a kick. My husband shouted, but a group of armed men flooded the house, barking orders for us to stay still. Two of them carried a strange scanning device, its screen flickering with incomprehensible patterns as they moved through the rooms. They found the drippings in less than a minute. The men in hazmat suits retrieved them, carefully sealing each piece in reinforced containers. No explanations were given, no questions answered. As they prepared to leave, one of the agents lingered. He leaned in close. "This never happened," he said, his eyes cold and unwavering. "You don't tell anyone. Not your neighbors, not your friends, no one. And just like that, they were gone. The vehicles sped off. The helicopters disappeared into the night, and the house fell silent once more. We were left standing in the ruins of our door, the faint scent of burnt metal lingering in the air. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, I wasn't sure it ever would be.
Jake wasn't the same guy I fell in love with 3 years ago. I noticed it when he first stopped laughing at my dumb jokes, the one he used to think were hilarious. Then, it was the way he started coming home later and later from work, or from wherever he said he was going. I chalked it up to stress. Jake had always been a little hard on himself, and this new job wasn't helping. There were so many deadlines, and his boss never seemed satisfied. It all piled on. When his mood didn't improve, I tried to talk to him. "Maybe you should see someone about it," I said gently one night, after he snapped at me for asking if he had eaten dinner. "I'm fine," he said, staring at the TV. "I just need to figure things out." It went on like that for a while. I started making plans for how I was going to end things, but whenever I tried to work up the courage to have the conversation, I just got overwhelmed. I felt selfish for wanting to leave when he was already going through so much. Part of me wondered if breaking up with him might put him over the edge. A few weeks later, one of Jake's high school friends moved back into town, and they went out for beers or something. When he got home, Jake said his friend offered to take him to this men's empowerment group. It was supposed to help guys get their lives together, he said. You know, focus on goals and stuff. It sounded a little odd, but I was glad Jake was taking an interest in something. "That sounds great," I said. "I hope it helps." Jake seemed to improve almost overnight. He started waking up earlier, going to the gym, and even cooking meals instead of ordering takeout. I was cautiously optimistic. Maybe this group was just what he needed. He told me that for the first time in years, he felt like he had purpose and direction, and I finally felt like we might actually have a future together. But then, he started changing in ways I didn't understand. He began talking about reclaiming his purpose, and how society was holding men back. I asked him what he meant, but he pretty much brushed me off. He said that men and women were different, and that he didn't owe me an explanation for every detail and decision. It wasn't like Jake to talk like that. What does that even mean? Jake shrugged. It's just the way things are. Modern society is a trap. You wouldn't get it. I felt hurt, but didn't push. I comforted myself by saying it was just a phase, something he'd grow out of. But the group meetings became more frequent, and Jake started spending entire weekends at workshops. He was vague about what they involved, and when I asked, he'd say things like, "You wouldn't understand," or "It's just a guy thing." The distance between us grew. Jake stopped asking about my day or making plans together. One night, I came home from work to find him sitting in the dark, scrolling through his phone. I flicked on the light to see if he was okay. "I'm fine," he said, without looking up. "Jake, you're not fine," I said, my voice trembling. "You're shutting me out. What's going on?" "I'm just figuring things out. The group is helping me. You wouldn't get it." "You keep saying that, but you're not the same. I don't even know who you are anymore." Jake didn't respond. He just stared at his phone, as if I wasn't even there. The breaking point came when Jake told me he was going on a retreat with the group. "It's a weekend thing," he said casually, as if it were no big deal. "Where?" I asked. "Some lodge outside the city. There's no cell service, but it'll be good for me." "No cell service?" I said, alarmed. "Jake, that sounds sketchy. Are you sure about this?" Jake bristled. "Mark says it's part of the process. You wouldn't understand." That phrase again. I wanted to scream. "Jake, I'm worried about you. This group, it's not normal. You're pulling away from me, from everyone. Please, just think about what you're doing." "You don't get it," Jake snapped. "This is important to me. If you can't support that..." Maybe you're the one with the problem. It felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. I wanted to fight back, to make him see how much he'd changed, but I could tell it was useless. Jake had made up his mind. The weekend he left for the retreat, I spent hours pacing the apartment, worrying. I tried to convince myself it would be fine, that Jake would come back and things would go back to normal. When he didn't return my calls or texts all weekend, my worry turned to anger, and then fear. By Monday night, Jake still hadn't come home. I couldn't take it anymore. I spent the last 3 days imagining every terrible scenario, and I had to know what was going on. After a quick search through his things, I found an address scribbled on the back of an old receipt. It was for a building in a rundown part of town. My stomach churned as I grabbed my jacket and keys. I didn't know if they'd be back from the retreat, but I had to try. When I got to the address, the place was creepy. This old storefront in an abandoned-looking strip mall, but there were cars parked in the lot, including Jake's. The windows were covered, and faint light spilled out from under the front door. I crept around to the side and found another door that was propped open. I slipped inside. The air was musty and smelled like old carpet, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I couldn't believe how sketchy it all felt, or how Jake could take anything seriously that happened in a place like this. Then I heard the faint sound of voices echoing from a room down the hallway. I followed the sound to a big room at the end. Inside, a group of men, including Jake, were standing in a circle. Mark, his friend from high school, was at the center, holding what looked like a carved wooden staff. They were all totally naked and covered from head to toe in red paint. The men were chanting, something low and rhythmic that blended into an unsettling hum. In the middle of the circle was a table with strange symbols carved into it. On the table sat a thick, blackened candle with a cartoonishly large flame. My stomach was knotted with dread. I wanted to run, but I couldn't hold back anymore. "Jake!" I shouted. The chanting stopped abruptly. Every head turned to look at me, and the room fell silent. Jake's face twisted with shock and something like guilt. Mark's expression, though, was calm and cold. "You shouldn't be here," Mark said, laced with menace. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, stepping further into the room. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Jake, let's get out of here, now." Mark raised a hand to silence Jake, who looked like he was about to speak. "This is his choice," Mark said, his gaze locking onto mine. "Jake must decide where he belongs. With us, where he can find purpose and strength, or back in the world that's been dragging him down." "Jake, please," I said. "This isn't you. Come home. We can figure this out together." Jake looked at me. His face was conflicted, but slowly, his expression hardened. "I'm sorry," he said. "I need this." The ground had dropped out from under me. "Jake, no," I said. "You don't understand what you're doing. They're manipulating you." Mark stepped between us, his imposing frame blocking my view of Jake. "It's time for you to leave," he said firmly. 2 men from the group moved towards me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Jake!" I screamed one last time, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the floor as Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. I ran out of the building, tears streaming down my face. When I reached my car, I just sat there, trying to process what just happened. Jake had chosen them over me, over us. The man I loved was gone, swallowed up by something I couldn't fight.